Mrs. VellI never thought I'd be reinventing myself at 68. The day I discovered Leonard's affair, I was pruning my prized roses in the garden of the home we'd built together over 35 years of marriage. His phone buzzed on the patio table, a text from Calista with a heart emoji. Something made me look. 3 simple words. Missing you terribly. In that moment, the carefully tended garden of my marriage revealed its hidden rot. 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories suddenly felt like an elaborate façade. What Leonard never realized was that his careful deception had one fatal flaw. Calista lived in the Harborview Apartments, a property I'd quietly purchased 7 years ago as a personal investment. He'd been paying rent to me all along. Did I confront him immediately? No. I had something far more satisfying in mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose my story truly begins not with Leonard's betrayal, but with the choices I made long before I ever suspected him of infidelity. Before I was Mrs. Vellicourt, before I was anyone's wife or mother, I was simply Iris Harrington, a promising young architect with ambitious dreams and a portfolio full of innovative designs that prioritized both beauty and functionality. I graduated at the top of my class from Cornell in 1978, one of only 8 women in a program of 43. My professors called me tenacious. My male classmates called me difficult. I preferred to think of myself as determined. I met Leonard at a charity gala in Seattle when I was 33, already considered advancing in years for an unmarried woman in those days. He was 38, devastatingly handsome with salt and pepper temples that belied his youth, and he moved through the crowded ballroom with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. I was there representing my small but growing architectural firm, hoping to network with potential clients. Leonard was there because, as I would later learn, he never missed an opportunity to be seen. "That's an interesting brooch," he said, approaching me at the bar where I was nursing a gin and tonic. I glanced down at the silver architectural compass pinned to my emerald green dress. "It was my father's," I replied. "He was an architect too." "Was?" Leonard asked, his voice softening. "He died when I was in college. Heart attack at his drafting table. He was working until the very end." I smiled sadly. "The way he would have wanted it. And you followed in his footsteps." It wasn't a question. "I did. Iris Harrington." I extended my hand. "Harrington Design Associates. Leonard Vellicourt," he replied, his handshake firm but not overbearing. "Vellicourt Properties." His eyes, a clear, striking blue, assessed me with open appreciation. "I develop luxury condominiums along the waterfront. Perhaps we might have something to discuss professionally." That was Leonard, always blending business with pleasure, always looking for an angle. But back then, I found his directness refreshing. We danced that night and he called the next day. 3 months later, he proposed on a sailboat in Puget Sound, the Seattle skyline glittering behind him like a promise. I said yes without hesitation. The early years were good. Leonard respected my career and seemed proud to have a wife who was building her own reputation in a field dominated by men. We were busy but happy, working hard during the week and sailing on weekends when the weather permitted. Our daughter, Juno, arrived 2 years into our marriage, an unexpected but welcome addition to our lives. Our son David followed 3 years later. I scaled back my hours at the firm but refused to give up working entirely, much to my mother-in-law's disapproval. "A woman's place is with her children." Elaine Vellicourt would say during her monthly visits, her voice dripping with polite venom. Leonard needs a wife, not another business partner. I would smile tightly and pour her more tea. Leonard married an architect, Mother Vellicourt. He knew exactly what he was getting. Behind closed doors, Leonard would laugh and pull me close. "Don't mind her," he'd say. "She's from a different generation. I love that you have your own thing." "My own thing?" I'd repeat, slightly annoyed at the diminutive phrasing but too content to argue. "My career, you mean?" "Of course," he'd concede with a charming smile. "Your career." Looking back, I should have recognized the subtle warning signs. The way he would casually undermine my professional achievements. The way his support always came with small caveats. But we were building something together. A family, a legacy, a life. His business flourished through the booming 1980s and 90s, expanding from Seattle to Portland and eventually down the coast to San Francisco. My firm remained smaller but developed a sterling reputation for sustainable, innovative designs. The dynamic began to shift when I turned 50. Leonard had just completed his most ambitious project yet, a gleaming high-rise in downtown Seattle that redefined the city's skyline. I was busier than ever with environmentally conscious renovation projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. We were financially secure, the children were in college, and by all outward appearances, we had achieved the perfect balance of family success and professional fulfillment. Then Leonard suggested I step back from my firm. "You don't need to work so hard anymore," he said one evening, as we sat on our terrace overlooking Elliott Bay, the sunset casting long golden shadows across the water. "We have more than enough money. Wouldn't you like to travel more? Maybe spend more time with the grandchildren when they come along?" I studied his face, still handsome at 55, though the boyish charm had hardened into something more calculated. "I love my work, Leonard. I'm not ready to retire." "Not retire completely," he amended, reaching for my hand. "Just transition to something less demanding. Maybe consulting, or teaching at the university." "Why would I do that when I'm at the peak of my career?" "Because I miss you," he said simply. "I'm thinking about slowing down myself in the next few years. We could enjoy life a little more." It was a convincing performance. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was acknowledging that my husband of nearly 25 years was asking me to diminish myself to soothe his ego. I agreed to reduce my client load and take on a part-time teaching position at the University of Washington's architecture program. 6 months later, Leonard announced his biggest project yet, a luxury development on previously untouched land, near Olympic National Park. "I thought you were slowing down," I said, bewildered. "This is the last big one," he promised. "A capstone project. I couldn't pass it up." I nodded and said I understood. What else could I do? I had already begun the process of stepping back from my firm, transitioning leadership to my talented protégé, Monica Chen. Leonard's deception wasn't malicious, I told myself. It was just business. That same year, I made my first independent real estate investment. A small but elegant apartment complex in Seattle's vibrant Capitol Hill neighborhood. The Harborview Apartments, 24 units in a beautifully restored 1920s building with original hardwood floors, crown molding, and an unobstructed view of the bay. I used money I'd inherited from my parents and profits from my firm to make the purchase. Leonard knew about it, of course. I never kept financial secrets from him. But he dismissed it as Iris's little hobby project. "Just don't lose your shirt," he said with that indulgent smile I was beginning to resent. "Real estate can be cutthroat." I smiled back pleasantly. "I'll keep that in mind." What Leonard failed to realize was that I'd spent 30 years observing his business methods, learning from both his successes and his mistakes. I hired an excellent property management company, but kept a close eye on the operations myself. Within 3 years, I had doubled my initial investment and purchased a second property, a smaller building in Ballard, then a third in Fremont. By the time I turned 65, my little hobby project had grown into a quiet but impressive portfolio of 7 properties across Seattle, all managed through a limited liability company I had established, Harrington Legacy Investments, named after my father. Leonard remained largely uninterested in my investment activities. He was too busy with his own empire to notice that I was building one of my own, smaller, perhaps, but solidly profitable and free of the ethical compromises that increasingly characterized his work. The environmental controversy surrounding his Olympic Park development had aged him almost overnight, adding lines to his face and a perpetual defensiveness to his demeanor. He won the battle eventually, pushing the project through with political connections and legal maneuvering. But the victory seemed hollow. The Leonard who had once charmed rooms full of people now seemed irritable and restless, impatient with everyday life and increasingly absent. I was busy with my own pursuits, my investments, my part-time teaching, my volunteer work with a women's shelter where I was helping redesign their facilities. The gradual emptying of our marriage happened so subtly that I hardly noticed it until the space between us had grown too vast to bridge with casual conversation. We still attended events together, still took an annual vacation to the San Juan Islands, still hosted holiday gatherings for our growing family. But the quiet moments, the shared confidences, the gentle touches, the private jokes, those had vanished like morning mist. I told myself this was normal, that long marriages inevitably evolved into something more practical than passionate. Juno had married her college sweetheart and moved to San Francisco, where she was making waves in the tech industry. David had followed his father into real estate development, though he focused exclusively on affordable housing projects. A choice that filled me with quiet pride and Leonard with barely concealed disappointment. We had 3 grandchildren between them, all under the age of 10. I had a good life, a fortunate life, even if my marriage had cooled to a civil partnership. Then came the text message from Calista, now sitting in my garden with Leonard's phone in my hand. I felt a strange sense of clarity descend. The initial shock gave way to something else, a cold, analytical curiosity. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? And why, despite 35 years of building a life together, did I feel more numb than heartbroken? I replaced the phone exactly where Leonard had left it and continued pruning my roses, methodically removing dead growth to encourage new blooms. My mind raced ahead, considering and discarding possible reactions. I could confront him immediately, demand answers, throw his designer luggage onto our manicured lawn in a fit of justified rage. I could call our children, expose his infidelity, destroy the carefully crafted image he had spent decades building, or I could wait, observe, gather information. One thing was already clear. Calista wasn't new. The casual nature of her message suggested an established relationship. The heart emoji indicated intimacy. The absence of context, missing you terribly, rather than missing you terribly since lunch yesterday, suggested regular, ongoing contact. I finished with the roses and washed my hands at the outdoor sink, my movements deliberate and controlled. Inside, I heard Leonard's voice as he conducted a business call in his study. The familiar cadence of his speech, confident, persuasive, with that touch of impatience when things weren't moving quickly enough, now seemed like a performance I was hearing with new ears. That evening I prepared grilled salmon with dill, sauce, Leonard's favorite, and poured us each a glass of the Pinot Gris we'd discovered on our trip to Oregon's Willamette Valley last summer. I wore the blue dress he had once said brought out the silver in my eyes. I arranged my features into a mask of contented domesticity and asked about his day. Exhausting. He sighed, cutting into his fish with precision. The zoning committee is being difficult about the Westlake project. That's too bad, I murmured sympathetically. I'm sure you'll win them over. You always do. He looked up, momentarily, surprised by my confidence in him. When had I stopped offering that kind of automatic support? When had he stopped expecting it? I hope so, he said, his expression softening. This one's important. They all are, I replied with a gentle smile. After dinner, Leonard retreated to his study while I cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher. Then, alone in the kitchen with only the soft hum of appliances for company, I allowed myself a moment of pure, unfiltered rage. My hands gripped the edge of the marble countertop, knuckles whitening with the effort of containing the storm inside. Me. 35 years, 3.5 decades of shared history, reduced to this. A secret phone, a hidden woman, a life conducted in shadows. But even as the anger surged, another part of my mind, the architect, the strategist, the woman, who had navigated a male-dominated profession by thinking 3 steps ahead, was already forming a plan. I would need help, and I knew exactly who to call. Marlowe Quinn had been my friend since our first year of architecture school. When I stayed on the design path, she had pivoted to law, specializing in real estate and later, family law. She had handled all my property acquisitions and helped establish my LLC. More importantly, she had never liked Leonard. He's too smooth, she'd said at our wedding reception, already 3 glasses of champagne deep and characteristically blunt. Like he's selling something even when he's just saying hello. I'd laughed it off then. Now, the memory made me reach for my phone. Iris? Marlowe's voice was alert despite the late hour. Is everything okay? I need to see you, I said simply. Tomorrow if possible. And Marlowe, I need absolute discretion. There was a pause then. My office, 10 a.m. Come through the back entrance. I'll tell Rebecca to clear my calendar until noon. I hung up and took a deep breath. Then I opened my laptop and began my research. The name Calista wasn't particularly common in our age bracket, but without a last name, I had little to go on. I started with the most obvious approach: social media. Leonard and I both maintained minimal profiles. Facebook, for keeping up with far-flung family members. LinkedIn for professional connections. I logged into Facebook and typed Calista into the search bar, then filtered the results to Seattle. 23 women, ranging from teenagers to elderly. I began systematically reviewing their profiles, looking for any connection to Leonard or his business. After an hour of digital detective work, I found her. Calista Rourke, curator at the Westridge Gallery in downtown Seattle. Leonard had been on the gallery's board of directors for the past 6 years, a position he had taken at the urging of his public relations team, who thought association with the arts would soften his image after the Olympic Park controversy. I clicked through her public photos. She was beautiful, perhaps 40, with a cascade of auburn hair and an elegant, angular face. artistic, sophisticated. Young enough to make Leonard feel virile, old enough not to seem ridiculous on his arm. Closed the laptop, suddenly exhausted. Tomorrow I would talk to Marlowe. Tomorrow I would begin to understand the full scope of what I was facing. Tonight I would sleep beside my husband of 35 years and pretend I didn't know that our life together had been built on sand. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. Silver hair swept into a simple knot, fine lines mapping a life well lived around my eyes and mouth, shoulders still straight and proud. I paused, studying this woman I had become. Somewhere beneath the shock and anger, a strange, unexpected feeling was taking root. Not just betrayal, not just hurt, curiosity. What would Iris Vellacourt, Iris Harrington, do now with this unwelcome knowledge? What shape would the rest of her life take? For the first time in decades, the future stretched before me, unscripted and unknown. I turned away from my reflection and continued up the stairs, where Leonard was already asleep, his reading glasses perched on the nightstand, beside a dog-eared biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, a Christmas gift from me 3 years ago, that he was only now getting around to reading. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, and stared at the ceiling, my mind whirling with possibilities. Sleep eluded me until the early hours of the morning, when I finally drifted off with one clear thought. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. Marlowe's office occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse in Pioneer Square, its exposed brick walls and soaring ceilings softened by her collection of Pacific Northwest indigenous art and the sprawling plants that thrived in the abundant, natural light. I'd always loved this space. It reminded me of the design studio I'd dreamed of having when I was in school, before pragmatism and financial reality led me toward more commercial projects. "You look like hell," Marlowe said by way of greeting, rising from behind her massive desk of reclaimed Douglas fir. At 70, she remained striking, tall and angular with a shock of white hair cut in a severe bob that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and piercing dark eyes. She'd never married, never had children, and had built one of the most respected boutique law firms in Seattle through sheer force of will and uncommon intelligence. "Good morning to you too," I replied, accepting her brief, fierce hug before settling into one of the leather armchairs across from her desk. Through the wall of windows behind her, I could see Elliott Bay, a container ship slowly making its way toward port under a pearl-gray sky threatening rain. Marlowe studied my face for a long moment, then pressed a button on her desk phone. "Rebecca, hold all calls, and bring us coffee, please. The good stuff." She released the button and leaned forward. "Now, tell me what's happened." I explained about the text message, about Calista Rourke and the Westridge Gallery, about the cold calculation that had replaced my initial shock. Throughout my recitation, Marlowe's expression remained neutral, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she nodded once, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "And what do you want to do about it?" she asked. "I don't know, yet," I admitted. "Part of me wants to burn everything to the ground, but another part of you is curious," Marlowe finished for me. "About how far this goes, about what else you don't know." "Yes," I said, relieved she understood. "And about what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. Because whatever happens, things can't go back to the way they were." A soft knock preceded Rebecca's entrance with a tray holding a French press, 2 porcelain cups and a plate of the shortbread cookies I'd always favored. Marlowe waited until her assistant had left, closing the heavy door behind her, before pouring the coffee. Black for herself, with a splash of cream for me, just as I'd taken it since college. "You have options," she said, handing me a cup. "More than most women in your position. Because of my investments. Because of your foresight," she corrected. "You built a safety net while Leonard was busy building his ego. Now let's talk about what that means, practically." For the next hour, Marlowe outlined potential courses of action. Everything from quiet diplomacy, approaching Leonard privately, negotiating a separation agreement that would preserve our public image and protect our shared assets, to scorched earth, immediate divorce proceedings, public exposure, maximum financial penalties for infidelity. I listened carefully, asking questions where necessary, weighing each possibility against my own confused emotions. "There's something else," I said finally, as Marlowe refilled our coffee cups. "Something I didn't mention earlier," she raised, an eyebrow, waiting. "I think I know where they meet," I said slowly. "Based on some things Leonard has said over the past few years, meetings that run late, properties he needs to check personally. I think he set her up somewhere convenient." "Not uncommon," Marlowe noted. "Men like Leonard often establish a love nest, somewhere private, somewhere—" "I think it might be in one of my buildings," I interrupted. "The Harborview, specifically." Marlowe set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Explain." "Last year, Leonard mentioned helping a promising young artist secure an apartment in Capitol Hill. He framed it as philanthropy, supporting the arts by providing affordable housing to creative talent in a desirable neighborhood." I laughed bitterly. "I remember being touched by his generosity. But now you think he rented a unit at Harborview for his mistress?" Marlowe's voice was flat. "Without realizing I own the building," I confirmed. "It would be just like him. Convenient, upscale, but not flashy, close to downtown. And he knows I never involve myself directly in tenant matters. I leave all that to the management company." Marlowe was silent for a long moment. Then a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "Iris Harrington," she said, using my maiden name as she always did when impressed. "You magnificent woman. Do you realize what this means? That I've been an unwitting accomplice in my husband's affair? Yes, the irony hasn't escaped me. No." Marlowe leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "It means you control the physical space where their relationship exists. It means you have leverage that Leonard doesn't even know about." "Leverage for what?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand her thinking. "For whatever you decide. Comes next," she replied. "But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's confirm your suspicion. I assume, as the property owner, you can access tenant records?" I nodded. "I receive quarterly reports from the management company. Names, lease terms, payment history. But I rarely review them in detail." "Perfect." Marlowe swiveled her computer, monitor toward me. "Log into your account. Let's see if Ms. Rourke is indeed enjoying your hospitality." 20 minutes later, we had our answer. Apartment 14B at the Harborview was indeed leased to Calista Rourke. The lease had begun 4 years ago, longer than I had suspected, and the rent was paid promptly each month from an account registered to Leonard Vellacourt Properties, classified in the system as a corporate housing arrangement. 4 years, I said quietly, staring at the screen. 4 years while I taught his favorite courses at dinner parties and planned his birthday celebrations and sat beside him at our daughter's wedding. Marlowe reached across the desk and squeezed my hand, a rare gesture of physical comfort from a woman who typically maintained strict professional boundaries, even with friends. "What do you want to do, Iris?" I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the course of my life. Part of me, the hurt, betrayed wife, wanted immediate confrontation, vindication, justice. But another part, the architect, the strategist, recognized the unique position of power I now occupied. I want to understand the full picture before I make any decisions, I said finally. I need more information. About the affair? About everything. About Leonard's current financial situation, about his future plans, about Calista herself. I met Marlowe's gaze steadily. Knowledge is power, isn't it? That's what you've always said. Indeed, she nodded approvingly. And as it happens, I have some resources that might help with that. Discreet investigations, financial forensics. No private detectives, I said firmly. I don't want anyone following them or taking photographs. This isn't about collecting evidence for a divorce court. At least not yet. Understood. Marlowe made a note on her legal pad. What about the apartment? Do you want to review the lease? There might be grounds to terminate it. I considered this for a moment, then shook my head. No. For now, I want everything to continue exactly as it has been. Leonard and Calista should have no idea that I know anything. A strategic retreat? Marlowe looked skeptical. A strategic assessment, I corrected. I'm going to visit the Harborview myself. Today. Is that wise? Marlowe frowned. What if Calista is there? What if someone recognizes you? I smiled thinly. No one will recognize me because no one there knows me. The building is managed by West Side Properties. All correspondence goes through them or my LLC. As far as the residents and staff know, Harrington Legacy Investments is just a corporate entity on their lease paperwork. And if Calista is home? Marlowe pressed. Then I'll introduce myself as a potential buyer looking at the building. It's not unusual for investors to tour properties they're considering purchasing. Marlowe leaned back in her chair, studying me with newfound respect. You've always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else, haven't you? Even now, when your world has been turned upside down, you're plotting and planning. Not always, I admitted, thinking of the years I'd been blind to Leonard's deception. But I'm trying to make up for lost time. We spent another hour discussing practical matters. Financial protections I should put in place. Communication strategies with our children should the truth become public. Preliminary steps toward a legal separation, if that became necessary. By the time I left Marlowe's office, I had a clear action plan and a strange sense of empowerment despite the circumstances. The rain had started while we talked, a gentle spring downpour that washed the city streets clean and lent everything a glossy, reflective quality. I declined Marlowe's offer of her car service and walked the 6 blocks to where I'd parked, letting the cool drops spatter against my face. The physical sensation was grounding, a reminder that life continued beyond the bubble of betrayal that now surrounded me. The Harborview Apartments stood on a quiet corner of Capitol Hill, its red brick façade and wrought iron balconies lending it an air of timeless elegance among the neighborhood's more modern developments. I had purchased the building because it reminded me of the brownstone where I'd grown up in Boston. Solid, dignified, built to last. Now, as I approached the front entrance with its original stained glass transom, I felt like a trespasser in my own property. The lobby retained its 1920s charm. Terrazzo floors, mahogany wainscoting, brass mail slots lining one wall. I had insisted on preserving these details during the renovation, arguing that they added character and value. The management company had balked at the expense, but Time had proven me right. The Harborview commanded some of the highest rents in the area precisely because of its historic appeal, combined with modern amenities. A young man sat behind the reception desk, focused on a computer screen. He looked up as I entered, offering a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" I had prepared a cover story, but standing there in the lobby of my own building, I suddenly felt ridiculous. No, I wouldn't pretend to be a prospective buyer or a curious neighbor. I would simply be myself, or part of myself. "Hello," I smiled warmly, approaching the desk. "I'm Iris Harrington with Harrington Legacy Investments. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by for an impromptu inspection." The young man, Benedict according to his name tag, immediately straightened. "Ms. Harrington, we weren't expecting you. I can call Mr. Patterson if you'd like. He usually handles the quarterly inspections." "That won't be necessary," I said, smoothly. I prefer to see the building in its natural state, not prepared for an official visit. Is there anything I should know about? Any maintenance issues or tenant concerns? Benedict hesitated, clearly unsure about protocol in this situation. "Everything's running smoothly, as far as I know. We had a minor issue with the elevator last week, but it was repaired within 24 hours. "Excellent," I nodded approvingly. "I'd like to walk the property, if you don't mind. Common areas, stairwells, perhaps a vacant unit if there are any." "Of course." Benedict rose from his chair. "I can give you a tour. We don't have any vacancies at the moment. Harborview is very popular. But I can show you the rooftop garden and the fitness room." I followed him through the building, making appropriate noises of interest as he pointed out various features and improvements. The property was immaculately maintained, I had to admit. Westside Properties was earning their management fee. "How long have you worked here, Benedict?" I asked as we climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. "Almost 3 years," he replied. "I started part-time while finishing my degree at Cornish College of the Arts. Now I'm full-time." "You're an artist?" He smiled sheepishly. "Sculptor, originally. But the bills need paying, so here I am." "Do you still create?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When I can find the time," he said. "I have a small studio in my apartment. Nothing like what I had at school, but enough to keep my hands busy." We reached the 4th floor, Calista's floor, and I deliberately slowed my pace. "Do many artists live in the building?" Benedict glanced at me, perhaps wondering why the property owner would care about the professions of her tenants. "A few," he said carefully. "Harborview attracts a creative crowd. The light is excellent, and the location is convenient for galleries and studios." "Anyone noteworthy?" I pressed, trying to sound merely curious rather than interrogative. I'm always interested in supporting local artists. Benedict seemed to relax slightly. "Well, Calista Rourke in 14B is making quite a name for herself. She's a curator at Westridge Gallery, but she's also an artist in her own right. Mixed media, very contemporary." "How interesting," I said, my heart rate accelerating despite my outward calm. "Has she lived here long?" "About 4 years, I think," Benedict replied as we continued down the hallway. Apartment 14B was 3 doors ahead on the right. I found myself holding my breath as we approached, irrationally afraid that Leonard might suddenly emerge from behind the door, exposing the charade. "Her apartment has one of the best views in the building," Benedict continued, oblivious to my internal tension. "Southeast corner, unobstructed sightline to the bay. She hosts small gatherings sometimes. Gallery people, collectors. Very quiet, very respectful of the other residents. We walked past 14B without incident, though I couldn't resist a sidelong glance at the door. It looked like all the others. Solid, oak with original brass numbers, recently refinished as part of the building's ongoing maintenance program. What happened behind that door? What version of my husband existed in that space? The rooftop garden is just ahead, Benedict was saying, leading me toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. It's one of our most popular amenities, especially in spring and summer. I followed him up the final flight of stairs, emerging onto the rooftop where carefully designed planting beds created a lush oasis 6 stories above the city streets. The rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and glistening. On clear days, the view would encompass Elliott Bay, the Space Needle, and the Olympic Mountains beyond, a panorama that justified the premium rents this building commanded. "This is lovely," I said, meaning it. "Who maintains the plantings?" "I do, actually," Benedict admitted. "It was part of why I was hired full-time. I studied landscape design as a minor, and Mr. Patterson thought it would be more cost-effective than hiring outside contractors." I walked to the edge of the roof, gazing out at the city I had called home for nearly 4 decades. Seattle had changed dramatically in that time, growing and evolving from a relatively quiet shipping town to a tech hub bristling with cranes and new construction. Through all those changes, Leonard and I had built our life together, raising children, pursuing careers, accumulating wealth and status and connections. Now I stood on the roof of a building I owned, looking down at an apartment where my husband conducted a secret life with another woman. "Ms. Harrington?" Benedict's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Is everything all right?" I turned to face him, suddenly aware that I had been silent for too long. "Yes, just admiring the view. Tell me, Benedict, how well do you know the residents?" He shrugged. "Pretty well, I guess. I work the day shift 4 days a week, so I see most people coming and going. Some stop to chat, others just nod hello." "And you notice things," I said, not a question, but an observation. There was an alertness about him, a quiet perceptiveness that reminded me of myself at his age. "I suppose I do," he acknowledged with a slight smile. "Occupational hazard of being an artist, always observing." "What have you observed about apartment 14B?" I asked, abandoning subtlety. "About Miss Rourke and her visitors by mid-morning. The storm had settled into steady rain, transforming the landscape. Seasonal streams swelled, and the floodplain's contours shifted as water accumulated in new patterns. Through it all, I maintained my observation post, rain gear draped over my camera equipment as I documented the ongoing saga. "Dr. Calloway," I protested. "The liability is mine," Wren finished firmly. "Document everything, but this needs to happen." "Wait. Wren? No, that wasn't right." My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the incongruity. I blinked hard. Water trickled down the side of my face, the rain blurring my focus. But it wasn't the downpour clouding my vision. It was the mention of a name that didn't belong in my present. That name didn't belong here. Wren Calloway. Not the name of an environmental scientist, or at least, not the one she claimed to be. A sharp memory cut through the fog of rain and tension. An article I'd skimmed 5 years ago, while researching urban redevelopment trends for a seminar. Wren Calloway. Not a field scientist, but a design consultant. And not just any design consultant. An architectural ghost. The kind who moves behind the scenes, often uncredited but always critical. She'd been involved in rewilding projects in neglected spaces across the country, subtly controversial ones, projects that reshaped entire blocks of a city without anyone knowing who had drawn the original plans. And she had published under another name, W. Harrington, my maiden name. I couldn't breathe for a moment, and it wasn't the rain or the stress. Something seismic shifted beneath my carefully reconstructed worldview. You're not just some contracted environmental consultant, are you? I said quietly, almost inaudibly. Wren froze. She turned toward me slowly, her face a careful canvas. What do you mean? She asked, her tone deliberately neutral. I stepped closer, the rain between us like a veil. W. Harrington. That was you. You designed the Thornbriar project in D.C., didn't you? The urban reclamation that displaced half a neighborhood, but saved a dying riverbed. Her expression tightened. I didn't expect you to recognize that name, she said finally. Not many do. You used my father's name, I said, not quite accusatory, but searching. Why? Wren exhaled, rubbing a hand across her brow, smearing mud across her sleeve. Because it was your father who mentored my mother. He believed in ecologically integrated architecture before it had a name. Your firm, Harrington Design, was her aspiration. I stared. I didn't know— You wouldn't, she interrupted. She was just a student in one of your early lectures at Cornell. She passed away when I was in college. I took her legacy and your family name and tried to finish what she started. I thought maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would do something good. I felt the earth tilt again, not from betrayal, but from the way this woman who I thought I'd figured out had layered her identity with pieces of my past I hadn't known were missing. But why hide it? I asked. Why act like this is just some environmental survey? Wren gestured to the land around us, her eyes sharper than the wind. Because this isn't just a land survey. This land, Iris, was never just yours or Leonard's or the city's. It's a key to something older, something deliberately buried, I frowned. What do you mean? She reached into her field satchel and pulled out a document case. From within, she produced an architectural blueprint, yellowed, brittle along the folds. My breath caught. I recognized the drawing style immediately. This is my father's, I whispered, taking it with trembling hands. Found in the city archives, Wren confirmed. Registered under a never-built proposal for sustainable workers' housing in the 1940s. Your father's final project before his death. Leonard purchased this land 10 years ago for a luxury community, remember? Yes. He said it was underused city property. Wren nodded grimly. Except your father had submitted this plan and been denied by a developer connected to the VellI family. The twist settled into my chest like a block of ice. A legacy I thought was mine, my family's story of perseverance, had been stifled by Leonard's forebears. And now, decades later, Leonard had planned to strip the land bare for personal profit. You knew this, I said, voice low. I suspected, she replied. But I couldn't be sure until we got the ground scans back yesterday. There are footings, the beginnings of foundation work. Your father started building this, and it was buried under permits and politics. I staggered back a step. Why tell me now? Because it changes everything, Wren said. This isn't just about Leonard's affair anymore. It's about a stolen legacy, about how this land, your father's vision, was nearly paved over by the same man who claimed to love you. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so If you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I turned away, the weight of decades pressing on my shoulders. Then we dig, I said, heart thudding. We uncover everything. Back at my house, the blueprint spread across the dining room table like a sacred text. The rain had finally slowed, but a storm still churned behind my ribs. I hadn't told Leonard about my morning. Yet, not about Wren, not about my father's lost project, and certainly not about the records I'd unearthed with Marlowe's help. Because Wren had been right. This wasn't just an affair. This was theft, both emotional and historical. Marlowe arrived just after noon, trench coat dripping and eyes razor-sharp. She took one look at the blueprint and let out a low whistle. "Well, damn," she said, leaning over the table. "This isn't just significant, it's potentially explosive." I told her everything. About Wren's real identity, about my father's hidden work, and about the growing suspicion that Leonard's development company had scrubbed more than just history. "I want to file an injunction," I said. "I want to stop the Westlake project." Marlowe blinked. "That would be a direct legal challenge to Leonard's company. Are you prepared for that kind of war?" "I am," I said simply. "Because it's not just a marital betrayal anymore. It's a generational one." Marlowe's expression darkened. "There's more," she said, pulling a slim file from her bag. "I had my financial team look into VellI Properties' current holdings. The Westlake project isn't fully funded. In fact, Leonard took out a personal line of credit against your joint trust fund 3 months ago." My stomach dropped. That money was meant for our grandchildren's education. "Exactly! And guess who signed off on the loan?" Marlowe's mouth twisted. "Calista, as his executive assistant. She's listed on the paperwork as a proxy signer." My knuckles turned white where I gripped the table edge, so she wasn't just a mistress. She was embedded in my husband's financial world. My world. "I want the Harborview lease terminated," I said suddenly. "And I want the tenants notified, subtly, that there's been a change in ownership." Marlowe raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" "Because I want Calista out," I replied. "And I want Leonard to know that every step he's taken has been on my property, literally and figuratively." Marlowe smiled grimly. "Then we'll proceed." But even as the power surged through me, this sense of control restored, I knew something had shifted deeper inside, because beneath the betrayal and the legal games, there was a blueprint, my father's vision, one that predated Leonard's greed and outlasted his deception. And I was beginning to understand that this battle wasn't just about vengeance or marriage. It was about legacy. It was about choosing what to rebuild and what to let collapse. And that, perhaps, was the greatest twist of all, that after everything, I had the freedom to design my life from the ground up. The Harborview was unusually quiet the morning I returned, a strange hush settling over the building, like the moment before a concert begins. Everyone waiting, bracing, listening for the first note. It was Benedict who greeted me again, this time with a knowing nod and a clipboard in hand. "We've posted the notice to vacate for apartment 14B, he said, voice low but firm. 30 days per your instruction. Calista hasn't responded yet. I imagine she's processing." I nodded, the corners of my mouth tightening. "Let me know when she does." "Of course, Ms. Harrington." It still felt odd to hear that name again. My name. My father's name. But now I wore it like armor. Iris Vellacourt had been a role, a mask of domestic elegance and diplomacy that no longer fit. Iris Harrington had designed bold buildings, fought zoning boards, and chased integrity with both hands. She had vision, and now she had leverage. I stepped into the elevator and hit the rooftop button, not to revisit the garden but to walk, to think. 4 years. That's how long Calista had lived in my building, rent paid from the company I helped grow, underwritten by assets I had built in silence. She had been a shadow in my marriage long before I knew her name. But I wasn't here to dwell. Today I had meetings. The conference room at Westside Properties was modern and efficient, with modular furniture, exposed ductwork, and those sterile Edison bulbs developers think make a place feel authentic. I sat at the head of the reclaimed wood table, Marlowe to my left, and Andrew Patterson, the building's property manager, across from us. I appreciate you seeing us on short notice, I began, adjusting the stack of folders I'd brought. There are some changes I want to implement across the Harborview portfolio, effective immediately. Andrew raised his eyebrows slightly. All 7 buildings. Yes, I said, starting with Harborview. Marlowe slid a document across the table. You'll find the amendments detailed in this summary. We'll be restructuring the community policies, updating the vendor agreements, and assuming direct oversight for all tenant screening moving forward. Andrew flipped through the pages, his professional mask slipping just slightly. This is a significant shift in protocol, Ms. Harrington. I smiled. So is betrayal. That hung in the air a moment longer than necessary. Andrew cleared his throat. Understood. What about the staffing contracts? Benedict stays, I said immediately. In fact, I'd like to see his position expanded. He's more than just a groundskeeper. Noted. It was a small moment, but one that mattered. Benedict reminded me of who I'd once been. Observant, underestimated, determined. Supporting his future felt like a seed planted in the right soil. When the meeting adjourned, Marlowe and I stepped into the parking garage, the echo of our heels trailing behind us like punctuation marks. Are you sure about all this? She asked. It's not just about reclaiming what's yours. You're turning Harborview into a flagship, a statement. Good, I said, unlocking my car. Because statements get noticed. Marlowe's eyes glinted. Speaking of which, Leonard's lawyer called. I froze mid-motion. And? He wants a meeting, this Friday. Leonard's finally realized something is off. Your silence is making him nervous. Let him wait, I said. We'll meet, but on my terms. Marlowe nodded. So what's next? I looked back toward the building, toward the city beyond it, the skyline now woven with both my past and my future. Now, I said, we start building the foundation. That afternoon, I found myself back at the university where I'd taught, part-time design courses, where I had once stood in front of bright-eyed 20-year-olds, with dreams of shaping the world in steel and glass and wood. I had resigned when Leonard asked me to slow down, but they'd kept my office as an honorary gesture, one that, apparently, they'd never reassigned. I opened the door and was immediately hit with the scent of old paper and faint dust, the ghost of ideas never fully realized. Blueprints lined the shelves. Architectural models stood on display like memories in miniature. I sat down and opened my father's old sketchbook. Wren had delivered it that morning, part of what she called the reclamation package. Documents, drafts, and field notes he'd kept before the city shut down his final proposal, the Thornbriar Project, my inheritance in lines and angles. It hadn't just been sustainable housing. He'd designed a living community, communal gardens, passive solar integration, water collection systems far ahead of their time. He'd dreamed of a world that could sustain both nature and people, and he'd drawn it when others were drawing parking lots. I felt a sting behind my eyes. So much had been stolen, not just from me, but from him, from the city, from the future we could have had. A knock on the door pulled me back to the present. "Iris," came a soft voice. I turned to see Monica Chen, my old protégé, now the director of Harrington Design Associates, standing in the doorway. She looked the same and entirely different, stronger, sharper, wearing her success well. "Monica," I said, rising. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You've been hard to reach." "I've been busy." She nodded, studying me. "You look clear." I raised an eyebrow. "Clear?" she smiled. "Focused. Like someone who knows what she's about to do." I gestured toward the desk. "I'm picking up where I left off. My father's designs. There's a way to revive them, not just architecturally, symbolically. But I need help." Monica sat down. "Say more." I spread the sketches out between us. The old ones, the new ones, my revisions, Wren's overlays, a hybrid legacy of 2 generations. "I want to rebuild the Thornbriar project," I said. "On the Westlake site." Monica's eyes widened. "That's Leonard's land." "Not entirely," I replied. "The development is fractured, underfunded. He used my trust to secure parts of it, but the surrounding lots are city-owned or under Harrington Legacy's umbrella. If we act quickly, we can intercept the approvals and redirect the entire zoning review. You'd have to go public. I know. And Leonard will fight you. I'm counting on it." She looked at me, then at the plans, then back again. "You're not just reclaiming your story." "No," I agreed. "I'm rewriting the ending." Later that night, I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of herbal tea, watching the rain bead on the railing. The house was quiet. Leonard out of town on another supposed business trip. No doubt with Calista scrambling to figure out why her lease was under threat. The silence didn't unsettle me anymore. It empowered me. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found Juno's name. My daughter picked up on the second ring. "Mom?" "Hi, sweetheart. Is everything okay?" I hesitated. "No, but it will be." A pause. Then, carefully. "What happened?" "I'll tell you everything. But I need you to come home. Just for a weekend. Bring the kids if you can." Juno didn't ask questions. She never had when it truly mattered. "I'll book flights tonight," she said. "David too?" "Yes," I said. It's time we all sat down together. The next day, I drove north to the community shelter where I'd been volunteering, one of the few constants in my life during the slow erosion of my marriage. The director, Amina, met me at the door. "Iris," she said with a radiant smile. "We weren't expecting you today." "Change of plans," I replied. "I need to see the garden project." Amina led me around back where the shelter's courtyard, once cracked concrete and forgotten trash bins, had slowly transformed into a green space, raised beds, native flora, a bench donated in memory of a former resident. "You did this," Amina said, pride in her voice. "No," I said. "We did. This was never just mine. But standing there among the blossoms and the bees, I realized something profound. I wasn't just reclaiming a name, or a legacy, or a property. I was reclaiming purpose." The final meeting that week was with Wren. We sat at an outdoor cafe, the rain finally easing into bright afternoon sunlight. She wore her usual raincoat, worn and practical, but her eyes sparkled with something different now. Anticipation. Or maybe faith. You ready? She asked. More than. I'm filing the historical preservation paperwork for the Thornbriar site, she said, sliding a folder across the table. It won't stop Leonard immediately, but it'll slow him, and it gives us time to file for the overlay zoning exception. I flipped through the documents. Everything was in order. Everything. Aligned. We're doing this, I said, half in disbelief. Yes, Wren said, and when it's done, it won't just be a monument to your father. No, I agreed. It'll be a beginning. She studied me. And when Leonard finds out, I smiled. Then the real storm begins. The Friday meeting was set for 10:01 a.m. sharp in the private conference room of Leonard's downtown office. A polished fortress of glass and concrete built on top of years of ambition, ruthlessness, and charm. Marlo and I arrived 10 minutes early. I wore navy, not black. Powerful, deliberate, and just removed enough from mourning. Leonard was already seated when we walked in, flanked by his attorney, Daniel Grange, a smooth-faced man whose suit probably cost more than my first apartment. Leonard stood when he saw me but didn't move to kiss my cheek, a subtle recognition that the dance had changed. "Iris," he said, trying a smile. "You look well." "I am," I replied, voice crisp. "Let's begin." No pleasantries, no scripted small talk, not today. Daniel opened his leather folder, pretending the tension in the room didn't slice the air into ribbons. "We're here to discuss a potential restructuring of assets in light of recent, emotional developments." He meant the affair, the lease termination. The silence that followed like smoke after fire. Marlo leaned forward. "We're not here to negotiate. Iris owns 7 properties in her LLC. 3 of those are appreciating faster than any of Leonard's current holdings. We've identified significant commingling of funds from shared trusts into Leonard's development arm, and we believe the use of those funds may violate both the marriage agreement and fiduciary duties." Daniel cleared his throat. "Those claims are speculative at best." I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the Thornbriar blueprints, my father's work, the city filings, Wren's preliminary report, and a letter of intent addressed to the Zoning Review Board. "I'm filing for a historical overlay," I said, "which will freeze all activity on the Westlake development for no less than 6 months. Leonard went very still. "Iris," he said, voice carefully neutral, "what are you trying to accomplish?" I leaned forward. "I'm protecting my father's legacy, and mine. You tried to bury it under another tower of ambition. But I'm the foundation now, Leonard. You just didn't notice." He looked at me with a mix of disbelief and dawning respect. "You've been planning this." "No," I corrected. "You've been giving me reasons." The silence that followed felt final, like the end of an era. Daniel tried to rally. "I think we'd all benefit from a private discussion between spouses." Marlo raised a brow. "That won't be necessary. We'll draft formal proposals within the week. Until then, we advise Leonard to halt any public-facing expansion and refrain from communicating with any tenants in Iris's buildings." Leonard looked at me again, this time not as a wife, but as an opponent. And then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel sound, nor even bitter. It was weary, disarmed. "All these years," he said quietly, "you were never just in the background. I thought I was the one building something." I stood. "You were. A house of mirrors." Then I turned and walked out. Back home, the phone. Calls started almost immediately. Juno, then David. Leonard had already reached out, trying to reframe the situation. I gathered them both the next morning in the dining room, the same one where I had once hosted birthday dinners and wine tastings and quiet holiday breakfasts. Juno paced, her arms folded, eyes sharp. David sat still, more cautious, his loyalty split down the center like a fault line. "I wanted to tell you sooner," I began, but I needed space to think without panic or pressure. "I knew something was wrong," Juno said. "You've been different for months." David frowned. "Why didn't you say anything, Mom? About Calista? About the money?" "Because I needed time to stop reacting," I said, "and start choosing. I told them everything. The affair, the building, the misused funds, the Thornbriar blueprints. I watched as Juno's anger simmered into something like awe, and David's disbelief gave way to quiet shame. "Dad's been reckless," he said finally. "We knew about Calista. We suspected. But this is sabotage." "Not sabotage," I said. "Truth, revealed slowly, brick by brick." I showed them the plans Wren and I had finalized, the proposed rebuild, the educational wing, the community garden, the shelter outreach tie-ins. It wasn't just architecture. It was justice with a roof. "I want you both involved," I said, "not because I need help, but because I want this to be bigger than me." Juno nodded, jaw tight. "We're in." David hesitated, then looked me dead in the eye. "You've got my support, Mom. I'll deal with Dad." For the first time, in months, I felt a tectonic plate of guilt shift off my chest. A few days later, I met Wren at the Westridge Gallery. It was, as expected, closed to the public that morning. But she had arranged for us to walk the exhibit, Calista's exhibit. The final one she'd curated before the notice to vacate had arrived. "She's not here," Wren said. "Left for Portland 2 days ago." I stepped through the space, each room a series of clean lines and muted palettes. The art was stark, unapologetic, layers peeled back in sculpture and paint. You could read pain in every brushstroke. One piece stopped me cold. It was a sculpture, glass and wire and resin, shaped like a fractured home, a house breaking in half at the foundation. "She knew," I said aloud. "She always knew." Wren didn't speak. She loved him, I added, but she hated herself for it. Still, Wren said nothing. I turned. "Why did you bring me here?" Wren walked over, handed me a sealed envelope. "She left this for you." I opened it. Inside, a handwritten note. "I didn't fall in love with him to hurt you, but I understand now that hurt doesn't require intention, only impact. I thought you were unaware, but I see now you were always awake, just patient. I wish I had known the difference between intimacy and power before it cost us both. I'm leaving the city. You own the space we shared. That seems fitting. Thank you for showing me what grace looks like." See, I folded the letter. My hands shook, not with grief, but release. "I don't hate her," I said. "Good," Wren replied. "Because she wasn't your final antagonist." "No," I said. "Leonard was. But he's not anymore." Wren tilted her head. "Then who is?" I looked at my own reflection in the glass. "The woman I used to be," I said. "She let this happen. She let herself become smaller to make others more comfortable. And now?" I smiled, just slightly. "She's gone." Back at the house, I began packing boxes, not of things, but of tokens. Memories I no longer needed to preserve in the same way. Leonard's books, his awards, his golf trophies, they would all be moved to his new condo when I filed for separation formally next week. But some things I left untouched. The sketches of my children's school projects, the first plant I'd brought from my father's Boston garden, a single wine glass from the set we received on our wedding day. The other 5 had broken, one by one. I kept the last as a reminder that some things survive, not because they are unbreakable, but because they are held with care. The room was packed. City officials, journalists, architects, activists, a scattering of curious citizens drawn by the scent of drama. You could feel the anticipation like heat rising from asphalt. At the center of it all stood the Zoning Commission, dais, 5 chairs arranged behind, a modest raised table flanked by mics and cardboard placards, the kind of setup that looked bureaucratic, but often carried the weight of entire neighborhoods on its shoulders. I stood behind the podium marked Public Comment. My father's original Thornbriar blueprint rolled tightly beneath one arm. Behind me, Monica sat near the front row, flanked by Wren and Marlowe. Juno had flown in the night before. David, too. My grandchildren, bless them, were watching from home. Leonard was somewhere in the room as well, though I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. I could feel his presence like a shift in barometric pressure. I'd been planning for this day for weeks, but the speech in my hand felt heavier than ink and paper. It was the culmination of more than a marriage, more than a betrayal. It was the closing of one story and the unrolling of another. The chairwoman of the zoning board, a woman named Marisol de Leon, with a sharp bob and sharper eyes, tapped her gavel once. We will now hear from Ms. Iris Harrington, representing Harrington Legacy Investments, regarding Motion 22-108B, the proposed zoning exception and historical overlay application for the Westlake parcels. My heels clicked against the laminate as I stepped up to the mic. The hall was silent, but not still. People leaned in. Pens hovered. Cameras blinked red. I looked down at my notes, then I folded them shut. "My name is Iris Harrington," I said, voice steady, microphone catching every syllable. "You may know me as the owner of the Harborview residential portfolio, or as a former architect and faculty member at the University of Washington. But before I was any of those things, I was the daughter of Frank Harrington." I paused, holding up the blueprint and slowly unrolling it across the small table. In 1947, my father submitted this plan to the city. It was a revolutionary design for worker-integrated sustainable housing, decades before the term green building existed. It was denied under pressure from private developers whose interests aligned with a family name many of, VellI. A ripple spread across the room. A few heads turned toward Leonard's seat. I continued. For 75 years, this vision lay buried, figuratively and literally, because the Westlake property, the one currently under proposed luxury redevelopment, was the original site of my father's plan. The foundations are still there, beneath the earth, forgotten, covered. I tapped the map. Until now. Marisol raised an eyebrow. "And you are proposing what, precisely, Ms. Harrington?" I turned the page on the easel beside me, revealing Wren's contemporary adaptation, an updated Thornbriar project, complete with energy-efficient systems, affordable housing units, cultural spaces, and sustainable gardens. A city within a city. Modest, beautiful, possible. I propose that the city reject the rezoning request submitted by VellI Properties. Instead, I propose that the city honor the legacy it denied by allowing the restoration and implementation of a revised Thornbriar plan. Another ripple, this time louder. Marlowe rose from her seat and handed out printed copies to the commissioners. Monica rolled out the 3D renderings across the visual display. The room came alive with movement. I let the motion carry itself for a moment. Then I looked directly at the camera broadcasting live. And for transparency, I said, I am also the majority funder of this revised proposal. Through my firm, my name, not my husband's. I turned back to the board. This isn't about revenge. It's about restoration, justice, and the future we choose to build, not over old bones, but from them. Then I stepped back, let the silence settle, waited. The meeting adjourned after 3 hours of questions, clarifications, polite pushback, and a flood of community support, many of whom I hadn't even known were watching until they stood up and spoke. I lived in Harborview for 2 years after my divorce, said a woman near tears. It was more than a building. It was healing. I worked with Frank Harrington in 1946, said a man in a wheelchair. He had vision. I can't believe it took this long. By the end, the zoning board promised a temporary halt to all construction on the Westlake site and scheduled a vote for the following month. A pause, but one loaded with potential. I exited the city building surrounded by a crowd, most of them strangers shaking my hand, calling me brave, fierce, brilliant. But I wasn't looking for any of them. I was looking for Leonard, and of course, he was waiting, standing beside his town car, hands folded in front of him, still in one of his sleek tailored suits. The kind he used to have custom made in Milan. He looked smaller now somehow. Less vivid. I walked right up to him. Iris, he said quietly. We need to talk. No, I said. We don't. Not anymore. His mouth opened, but I raised a hand. I've said everything I needed to say, in public, with facts, not secrets. You blindsided me. I smiled, mirroring the expression he used to give me when he thought he had the upper hand. Now you know how it feels. He exhaled. You never were just the architect. No, I said. I was the foundation. You just never read the blueprints. I turned, and this time, he didn't follow. Back at the Harborview, I climbed to the rooftop garden. The sun had started to set, casting a gold blush over the bay. Benedict was watering the beds, humming something low and melodic. You made the news, he said without turning around. So I've heard. They're calling you a visionary. I shrugged. I'm just finishing what my father started. He looked up at me, eyes warm. And beginning what only you could. I walked to the edge, staring at the skyline. Seattle's bones wrapped in steel and fog. So much had changed. So much had yet to. Benedict, I said. How would you feel about designing a rooftop installation? He blinked. Me? You're an artist. I've seen your work. And Thornbriar will need anchors, visual centers. Truth told in sculpture. His mouth opened. Closed. I'd be honored. Good, I said, feeling something open inside me. Because the future doesn't just belong to those who built the past. It belongs to those who see what it could be. The room was packed. City, officials, journalists, architects, activists, a scattering of curious citizens drawn by the scent of drama. You could feel the anticipation like heat rising from asphalt. At the center of it all stood the Zoning Commission dais, 5 chairs arranged behind a modest raised table flanked by mics and cardboard placards. The kind of setup that looked bureaucratic, but often carried the weight of entire neighborhoods on its shoulders. I stood behind the podium marked Public Comment. My father's original Thornbriar blueprint rolled tightly beneath one arm. Behind me, Monica sat near the front row, flanked by Wren and Marlowe. Juno had flown in the night before. David, too. My grandchildren, bless them, were watching from home. Leonard was somewhere in the room as well, though I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. I could feel his presence like a shift in barometric pressure. I'd been planning for this day for weeks, but the speech in my hand felt heavier than ink and paper. It was the culmination of more than a marriage, more than a betrayal. It was the closing of one story and the unrolling of another. The chairwoman of the zoning board, a woman named Marisol de Leon, with a sharp bob and sharper eyes, tapped her gavel once. We will now hear from Ms. Iris Harrington, representing Harrington Legacy Investments, regarding Motion 22-108B, the proposed zoning exception and historical overlay application for the Westlake parcels. My heels clicked against the laminate as I stepped up to the mic. The hall was silent, but not still. People leaned in. Pens hovered. Cameras blinked red. I looked down at my notes. Then I folded them shut. "My name is Iris Harrington," I said, voice steady, microphone catching every syllable. "You may know me as the owner of the Harborview residential portfolio, or as a former architect and faculty member at the University of Washington. But before I was any of those things, I was the daughter of Frank Harrington." I paused, holding up the blueprint and slowly unrolling it across the small table. In 1947, my father submitted this plan to the city. It was a revolutionary design for worker-integrated sustainable housing, decades before the term green building existed. It was denied under pressure from private developers whose interests aligned with a family name many of, VellI. A ripple spread across the room. A few heads turned toward Leonard's seat. I continued. For 75 years, this vision lay buried, figuratively and literally, because the Westlake property, the one currently under proposed luxury redevelopment, was the original site of my father's plan. The foundations are still there, beneath the earth, forgotten, covered. I tapped the map. Until now. Marisol raised an eyebrow. "And you are proposing what, precisely, Ms. Harrington?" I turned the page on the easel beside me, revealing Wren's contemporary adaptation, an updated Thornbriar project, complete with energy-efficient systems, affordable housing units, cultural spaces, and sustainable gardens. A city within a city. Modest, beautiful, possible. I propose that the city reject the rezoning request submitted by VellI Properties. Instead, I propose that the city honor the legacy it denied by allowing the restoration and implementation of a revised Thornbriar plan. Another ripple, this time louder. Marlowe rose from her seat and handed out printed copies to the commissioners. Monica rolled out the 3D renderings across the visual display. The room came alive with movement. I let the motion carry itself for a moment. Then I looked directly at the camera broadcasting live. "And for transparency," I said, "I am also the majority funder of this revised proposal, through my firm, my name, not my husband's." I turned back to the board. This isn't about revenge. It's about restoration, justice, and the future we choose to build, not over old bones, but from them. Then I stepped back. Let the silence settle. Waited. The meeting adjourned after 3 hours of questions, clarifications, polite pushback, and a flood of community support. Many of whom I hadn't even known were watching until they stood up and spoke. "I lived in Harborview for 2 years after my divorce," said a woman near tears. It was more than a building. It was healing. "I worked with Frank Harrington in 1946, said a man in a wheelchair. "He had vision. I can't believe it took this long." By the end, the zoning board promised a temporary halt to all construction on the Westlake site and scheduled a vote for the following month. A pause, but one loaded with potential. I exited the city building surrounded by a crowd. Most of them, strangers shaking my hand, calling me brave, fierce, brilliant. But I wasn't looking for any of them. I was looking for Leonard, and of course, he was waiting. Standing beside his town car, hands folded in front of him, still in one of his sleek, tailored suits, the kind he used to have custom-made in Milan. He looked smaller now somehow, less vivid. I walked right up to him. "Iris," he said quietly. "We need to talk." "No," I said. "We don't. Not anymore." His mouth opened, but I raised a hand. "I've said everything I needed to say, in public, with facts, not secrets." "You blindsided me." I smiled, mirroring the expression he used to give me when he thought he had the upper hand. "Now you know how it feels," he exhaled. "You never were just the architect." "No," I said. "I was the foundation. You just never read the blueprints." I turned, and this time, he didn't follow. Back at the Harborview, I climbed to the rooftop garden. The sun had started to set, casting a gold blush over the bay. Benedict was watering the beds, humming something low and melodic. "You made the news," he said without turning around. "So I've heard. They're calling you a visionary." I shrugged. "I'm just finishing what my father started." He looked up at me, eyes warm. "And beginning what only you could." I walked to the edge, staring at the skyline. Seattle's bones wrapped in steel and fog. So much had changed. So much had yet to. "Benedict," I said, "how would you feel about designing a rooftop installation?" He blinked. "Me?" "You're an artist. I've seen your work. And Thornbriar will need anchors, visual centers. Truth told in sculpture." His mouth opened, closed. "I'd be honored." "Good," I said, feeling something open inside me. "Because the future doesn't just belong to those who built the past. It belongs to those who see what it could be." The city council chambers were standing room only. I wore a dark green blouse, my father's favorite color, and a pendant Juno had given me years ago. A silver compass etched with the words, "Build what they said you couldn't." It felt like a blessing and a battle cry. Marlowe was on my left, Monica on my right. Wren stood just behind me, hair swept into a clean knot, blueprints tucked beneath one arm like a general carrying her war map. The children, my children, were there too. Juno in the second row, jaw set with fire. David calmer, but equally firm. Across the aisle, Leonard sat alone. No attorney, no Calista, no allies. He looked different now. Slightly slumped, not disheveled. He'd never allow that. But smaller somehow. The kind of small that doesn't come from weight loss, but from gravity finally catching up. Councilwoman Marisol de Leon called the session to order. Today we vote on Proposal 22-108B, submitted by Harrington Legacy Investments, with supporting Documentation for Historic Overlay, Community Zoning Reclassification, and Sustainability Permit Authorization. We also address the counter-petition submitted by VellI Properties. Her voice was calm, her face unreadable. But I didn't need to see the vote to know the truth, because the truth was already unfolding. "I'd like to invite Ms. Harrington to provide final remarks before deliberation," Marisol said, gesturing. "Toward the podium." I walked to the mic. This time I brought no notes. "I stand here not just for myself," I said, "but for everyone who's ever been told to quiet their ambition, to reduce their light to make someone else shine." The room hushed. I was once that woman. I was once quiet. I was once grateful for a seat at a table I helped build. I looked around, letting my gaze rest briefly on Leonard. "But today, I bring my own table." Soft laughter flickered through the crowd. Brief, supportive. My father died before he saw his final design come to life. That design, the Thornbriar Project, was a blueprint for equity before we had language for it. He believed architecture could be a force of healing. I do too. I pointed toward the mock-up beside me, the new rendering Monica and Wren had crafted. This is not just a building. This is a rebuke to erasure. This is reclamation. A place where we begin again. Not by paving over history, but by listening to it. I stepped back. No applause. That wasn't allowed during formal hearings. But the energy in the room shifted, forward, toward something new. Marisol nodded. "The council will now vote. 5 votes. The first came fast." "Aye," said Council Member Ortega, a veteran of housing activism. "Without hesitation." The second paused, then, "Aye." The third, "Aye." Leonard shifted in his seat. The 4th council member, a developer's darling, long suspected of ties to Leonard's firm, hesitated, then slowly, "Abstain." All eyes turned to Marisol. She didn't flinch. "Aye." 4 votes, 1 abstention. The motion passed. Thornbriar would be reborn. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned to Monica and embraced her. Wren gripped my shoulder, her fingers warm and grounding. Juno grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought I'd lose circulation. I squeezed back harder. Leonard rose, walked to the door without a word, and slipped into the hallway. And just like that, the man who once filled rooms with his presence now vanished without echo. 3 days later, I stood at the edge of the Westlake property. Hard hats and survey stakes dotted the land. The ghost of my father's work, his footings, his intentions, lay beneath our feet. We would break ground in 6 weeks. A plaque would go at the entrance. Not large, not flashy. Just this, Thornbriar Project, originally conceived by Frank Harrington, 1947. Reimagined and realized by Iris Harrington, 2025. Built for the future. Rooted in legacy. I pressed my palm to the cold concrete remains of the original foundation. It was imperfect, cracked, but it held. That night in my garden, I poured a single glass of wine and walked barefoot along the stone path I'd laid myself 20 years ago. The roses had returned early this season, blushing, open, wild. I sat on the bench where I'd once discovered the truth about Calista, where I'd sat in silence, trying to imagine a life beyond betrayal. Now I didn't have to imagine. I was living it. The house was quiet behind me, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine. I opened my notebook and began sketching. Not a building, not yet. Just lines, possibilities, the beginning of a new story. One where the heroine doesn't just survive betrayal. She builds something extraordinary from it. The first jackhammer struck ground at 7:02 a.m. on a gray June morning. I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in the pockets of my trench coat, the edges of a hard hat pressing against my palm, watching as workers in neon vests unloaded pallets of materials. The old fence surrounding the Westlake property had been removed days ago, along with the final remnants of Leonard's branded signage. Where his future had once been promised in gold lettering and modern renderings, now stood a single white banner, Thornbriar, a community rooted in history. Coming 2026, it still startled me sometimes, how quickly the tide could turn when you stopped waiting for permission. Wren arrived beside me, nursing a thermos of strong coffee, hair pulled into a wind-blown bun. They're ahead of schedule already. Monica's ecstatic. Good, I said. Let her be ecstatic. She's earned it. Wren smiled. So have you. I didn't respond right away. My eyes followed the line of the trench that had been dug just to the left of the original foundation. Surveyors were marking elevations. One of the older footings, the one we'd preserved per city instruction, would be turned into a community sculpture. Do you ever feel like you've stepped into someone else's life? I asked. Wren raised an eyebrow. You mean this isn't the life you wanted? It's the life I never let myself imagine. I turned to her. But now that I'm living it, it feels like breathing, like I've been holding my breath for decades. She didn't say anything, just nodded, then handed me a folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it to reveal a revised plan for the rooftop garden, Benedict's latest design. I thought you should be the first to see it, Wren said. I traced the pencil lines, flowing walkways, reclaimed stone, a sculptural installation formed from salvaged steel and glass, the ruins of the original foundation, reinterpreted as art. He's gifted, I murmured. And fiercely loyal, she added. He told me what he overheard Calista saying once, months before you ever found out. I blinked. He never told me that. He didn't think it was his place. Said he trusted you'd handle it when the time came. Said you were the kind of person who waits until the house is finished before she judges the blueprints. I looked back at the dig site, at the crew clearing a space for the new atrium. He's right, I said. But now the house is mine. 2 weeks later, I held a quiet dinner in the garden. Just family. No press, no formal announcement. Just wine, soft music, and the people who mattered. Juno brought a lemon tart. David arrived with a bottle of Malbec and his kids, who immediately ran into the roses to hunt for frogs. You've changed this place, Juno said as we set the table. Not so much changed it, I said, lighting a citronella candle, as reclaimed it. She smiled at that. I never told you this, but when I was 15, I wanted to be an architect, too. I blinked. What happened? You made it look too hard, she said with a laugh. Too precise. You had that drafting table in the guest room, and it always looked like some sacred altar. I figured I'd never be as good. I touched her hand. I wish I'd made it look more like an invitation. You do now, she said. You make reinvention look like a birthright. I didn't know how to respond to that. David joined us, sitting down with a groan. The kids are in full gremlin mode, he said. They'll be in the pond if we're not careful. I smiled. Let them. It's a warm night. He poured himself a glass of wine and looked at me. Have you heard from Dad? Once, I said. He sent a formal letter confirming the condo transition, signed the separation documents. No note, David nodded. I thought he might apologize or something. He did, I said softly, but it came too late and too quiet. I'm proud of you, Mom. It still startled me sometimes to hear that from my son. A boy I'd once rocked through croupy winters and tutored in trigonometry. Now a man in his own right. One who saw me not just as a mother, but as a woman who had risen. I let the moment rest between us like something holy. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into guest bedrooms, I sat in my office alone and wrote the last page of a letter I'd been working on for months. It was addressed to no one, and to everyone. A kind of memoir, a kind of confession, but mostly a blueprint for a different kind of legacy. It read, "I used to think a life was made from what you built beside someone. Now I know a life is also what you build after them, in the quiet, in the truth, in the strength you find beneath the rubble. Betrayal is not the end of a story. Sometimes it's the excavation before the foundation is poured. And I am building still." I closed the file, saved it under a new name, Foundation Complete.docx. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreams. The Thornbriar project opened on the first crisp morning of October, nearly a year after the blueprint was unfurled in that city council meeting. The air was dry and sharp, the kind that made the sky impossibly blue and the shadows long across the sidewalk. A ribbon stretched between two posts, wrapped in autumn leaves. No fanfare, no champagne tower. Just people. Residents, architects, city officials, neighbors, gathered like they were arriving at something quietly historic. I stood beside Ren and Monica, both of them dressed in black jackets, smiling but subdued. "It's beautiful," Ren said as we looked up at the finished central structure. Timber beams reclaimed from the original site, floor-to-ceiling windows, and solar awnings angled just so. "It's faithful," I replied. "To him, to what he wanted." The community atrium was already bustling. Inside, a local string quartet played something soft and rich. A few early residents, mostly families, moved around the edges, admiring the lobby's art installation, a circular sculpture of wire and concrete designed by Benedict Ortega, composed from remnants of the demolished foundations. I touched the cool metal of the plaque beside the sculpture, tracing my father's name, Frank Harrington, 1947, Iris Harrington, 2025, 2 generations. One vision, I'd requested the wording personally, not to be honored, but to be honest. It wasn't just a new building, it was a resurrection. The community garden thrived in raised beds designed with sloped pathways for accessibility. Tomatoes, kale, late-blooming dahlias, the scent of rosemary, and wet soil clung to the edges of my jacket as I walked with David and his youngest, Lucia, who toddled down the path with both hands outstretched like she was walking into a storybook. "She thinks she owns the place," David chuckled. "She's not wrong," I said. "It's for her, too." He stopped walking, turned to me. "You know, I was angry with you. For a little while." I looked at him without flinching. "I know. I thought you were trying to destroy everything Dad built." I gave him a moment. Let the words settle. "And now?" I asked. He looked around, at the families planting bulbs, at the children running over grass, at the building rising behind the garden, solid, elegant, filled with light. "Now I think you saved what mattered." I nodded once. "That's all I wanted." That afternoon, Juno hosted a panel inside the new community space. A talk about legacy, storytelling, and reimagining power. I was the closing speaker. I didn't prepare remarks. I simply walked to the podium when it was my time, took a deep breath, and spoke. I used to think legacy was something you left behind. A plaque, a name on a foundation, a building in someone else's story. I scanned the room. Mostly young, faces, students, residents, friends. But legacy is also something you live through, something you correct, something you name for what it is and what it wasn't. A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. "This place," I said, gesturing to the ceiling, was once a ruin, a foundation for a dream that got paved over. Then I placed both hands on the podium, grounding myself. But foundations crack, and when they do, you don't abandon the whole structure. You reinforce it, you learn from the pressure points, you dig again, and you build better. I stepped back. No applause. Just silence. And then, slowly, a standing wave of acknowledgement that filled the space more profoundly than any noise. The next morning I returned to the house alone. The garden glowed in its end-of-season blush, bronze, deep burgundy, the last lavender blooms holding onto the air like a secret. The sky felt lower than usual, heavy with impending rain. My roses were still blooming, defiantly. I wandered barefoot, stopping to deadhead a few spent petals. It had been 1 year since the text message. 1 year since I held Leonard's phone in my hand and felt the quiet shattering of 35 years of trust. A year since I began again. And now, as I moved through the garden, I didn't feel like someone piecing herself back together. I felt like someone new. My phone buzzed. A message from Monica. Final press release drafted. Want me to send it to the Times? Thornbriar, their headline story this weekend. I replied, yes, but let's keep it humble. This isn't about us. It's about what's possible. She replied with a thumbs up and a heart. I set the phone down on the garden bench and opened my sketchbook. I hadn't drawn in a week. Not since the final sign-off on construction. But today felt like a beginning, not an ending. I let my pencil move without plan. Just motion, arches, circles, a sun window. Something not yet real, but already rooted. Later, that week, a letter arrived. Postmarked Italy, Leonard. It was handwritten on thick paper. My name in his careful architectural scrawl. Inside was a note. Sparse, sincere. I didn't read it all at once. I let the words breathe between sips of tea. Iris, I don't ask for forgiveness, but I hope time does something with the regret I carry. I've stepped away from the business. I'm spending a season in Lucca, walking, writing, listening to things I never noticed before. You were right about everything. Leonard, no signature flourish, no guilt-heavy confession. Just a man who had finally stopped performing. I folded the letter and placed it in my father's old drafting drawer. Not because I needed it, but because some ruins still deserve a resting place. As the year closed, I taught my first full class at the university since I'd left, a course titled Architecture and Memory. Enrollment was small. The classroom smelled like old paper and new ambition. I stood before the whiteboard and began. Architecture isn't about control. It's about invitation, about shaping space so others can imagine who they might become inside it. A girl in the front row raised her hand. Did you always know you'd return to architecture after your break? I smiled. I never left it, I said. I just forgot I could build for myself. On the first day of the new year, I hosted an open garden brunch. Just a handful of people, close friends, new collaborators, a few Thornbriar residents who'd moved in early. Benedict brought a bouquet from the rooftop greenhouse. Juno's youngest had drawn a crayon version of the atrium and taped it to my refrigerator. Someone brought a pie. Someone else brought a guitar. We sat in the garden as the wind stirred the chimes. I passed around glasses of pear cider and watched as laughter filled the space I had once mourned in silence. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new genre. That night I sat down at the same window seat where I had begun the sketch that became Thornbriar. The light outside had changed, softer, more forgiving. My silver hair hung loose around my shoulders. I opened a fresh journal and began with a single sentence. I never thought I'd start over at 68. But I have, and not just once. I paused, then added, the truth is I'm always starting, always drafting, always uncovering the next foundation beneath the one I thought I'd finished. I looked out the window at the garden, where the wind danced through the roses. Somewhere beyond, the Thornbriar community was winding down for the night. Porch lights glowed, new lives beginning. I closed the journal, and I smiled, because I wasn't the woman who got left. I was the woman who built what came after. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.